The morning of December 7, 1941, broke clear and cold over Tokyo. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood at his office window in the Oto district, gazing out across the imperial palace grounds that glowed softly in the pale winter light. Below, the streets were alive with movement and sound, crowds gathering, voices rising, the unmistakable energy of celebration spreading like wildfire through the capital. The news had reached Tokyo within hours. Japanese carrier planes had descended on Pearl Harbor with stunning precision, their attack calculated to the second. In just 12 hours, the battleship fleet lay shattered, 8 vessels damaged or sunk. Nearly 2,400 Americans gone, 350 military aircraft reduced to twisted metal on the ground. From a purely tactical perspective, it was flawless. The Japanese naval pilots had achieved what military strategists considered impossible: complete surprise against an enemy base. They'd executed their assigned mission with a level of skill and bravery that commanders back in Tokyo were already celebrating. The streets filled with jubilant citizens convinced Japan had just struck a decisive blow against American naval power. Yet in his office, Yamamoto sat alone. While the rest of the nation reveled in what they saw as Japan's greatest military triumph, something entirely different occupied his mind. A deep, gnawing dread consumed him, the feeling that what appeared to be victory was actually the opening move in a catastrophe he could not prevent. Years spent in America had shaped his understanding of the world in ways his fellow officers refused to accept. He had walked through Pittsburgh's steel mills, watching blast furnaces pour out metal in quantities that seemed almost unreal. A single day's output from those American facilities exceeded what entire Japanese mills could produce in a month. He had driven past the endless automobile factories of Detroit, watching assembly lines move with mechanical precision that Japanese industry simply could not match. He had seen California's agricultural valleys stretching endlessly, producing food surpluses that could feed millions, while Japan struggled to provide enough rice for its own population. The other senior commanders dismissed his concerns. They refused to believe what the evidence plainly showed: that America possessed an industrial capacity so vast it bordered on the incomprehensible to Japanese minds. Now, while they celebrated in the streets, Yamamoto understood the terrible mathematics that would follow. The numbers his colleagues were so proud of would soon become the numbers of Japan's undoing. What they could not, or would not accept, was what would happen next. This attack would trigger something unprecedented in human history: an industrial mobilization so complete and so rapid that within 6 months, American production would shatter every assumption Japanese war planners held about their enemy's capabilities. The metaphor that would later become famous, the sleeping giant waking in fury, was not how it actually happened, but the underlying truth was undeniable. Once aroused, America would prove unstoppable. And it would not be military defeats that destroyed Japanese strategy first. It would be the words of one man, delivered in a speech before Congress. 30 days passed. The calendar turned to January 1942. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress on the 6th day of the month, ready to deliver his State of the Union address. Japanese intelligence officers monitoring the broadcast would later dismiss what they heard as propaganda and fantasy, American morale-building rhetoric with no connection to reality. Roosevelt announced his production goals: 60,000 military aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943, 45,000 tanks in 1942, 75,000 more in 1943, 20,000 anti-aircraft guns in 1 year, 35,000 in the next, 6 million tons of merchant shipping in 1942, 10 million tons in 1943. Japanese analysts initially interpreted these as single-year targets. Even when they understood Roosevelt meant a 2-year program, the numbers seemed not just ambitious, but fantastical. To grasp the scale of what Roosevelt was claiming, consider this: Japan had produced roughly 5,000 aircraft during the entire year of 1941. America, not yet mobilized for full wartime production, had built approximately 19,000 military aircraft that same year, nearly 4 times Japanese output before any serious wartime conversion had even begun. The gap was already enormous. Then Roosevelt announced he wanted 60,000 aircraft in 1942 alone. That would be 12 times what Japan had produced the previous year, more than 3 times what America itself had built when it wasn't fully mobilized. Every Japanese aircraft factory, running at maximum capacity with shifts working around the clock, produced roughly the same output as a single American state. Japanese military planners simply could not conceive of industrial power on such a scale. Yamamoto had tried to warn them. Months before the Pearl Harbor attack, back in 1941, he had spoken privately with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe about exactly this danger. Historians still debate the precise date of their conversation, with sources pointing to somewhere between early 1940 and November 1941, but the substance of what Yamamoto said has been well documented. If we are ordered to do it, I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months, but I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years. The Admiralty had dismissed his warning. The Army General Staff had treated his caution as weakness, as defeatism unbecoming a warrior. They pointed instead to signs they believed demonstrated America's weakness: the isolationist sentiment that ran deep in American politics, the labor disputes that plagued American industry, the racial tensions that divided American cities, the partisan political divisions that seemed to paralyze American government. These divisions, they argued, meant America lacked the unity and discipline required for modern total war. They were catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the American industrial machine began transforming itself in ways that would establish new rules for modern warfare and create standards for national mobilization the world had never witnessed. On January 16, 1942, exactly 40 days after the attack, the War Production Board was established. Its chairman was Donald Nelson, a former Sears executive with absolutely no military background. Yet Nelson possessed authority unprecedented in American peacetime history. He could commandeer factories, redirect raw materials and resources, set production quotas, and transform entire industries overnight. His power, granted through the War Powers Act, was nearly absolute when it came to industrial production decisions. The speed at which American industry converted stunned even those who understood American manufacturing capability. General Motors, the largest automobile manufacturer in the world and the quintessential symbol of American industrial power, produced its final civilian car on February 10, 1942, just 64 days after Pearl Harbor. A Chevrolet sedan rolled off the assembly line at noon. By midnight, that same assembly line was being reconfigured for tank production. Within weeks, the massive Willow Run plant outside Detroit, purpose-built by Ford to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers, came online. The facility was so enormous it contained its own railway system, its own power generation plant, and its own fire department. At peak production, one complete bomber came off the line every 63 minutes. Ford, Chrysler, Studebaker, Packard, every major automobile manufacturer in America stopped producing civilian vehicles entirely. These same factories had churned out 4.5 million cars in 1941, satisfying the American appetite for personal transportation and embodying the American way of life. For the duration of the war, they would produce exactly 0 civilian automobiles. Instead, their assembly lines manufactured tanks, aircraft engines, artillery shells, machine guns, and military vehicles in quantities that Japanese planners had calculated were mathematically impossible given what they believed America's pre-war industrial base to be. The automobile industry's conversion revealed something crucial about American industrial flexibility. A factory designed to build car engines could be retooled to build aircraft engines with relatively minor modifications. Workers skilled at assembling automobile transmissions could learn to assemble tank drivetrains. The fundamental infrastructure remained the same: the machine tools, the trained workforce, the management systems, the supply chains, and all of it could be redirected toward military production with astonishing speed. Japan had nothing comparable. Japanese military production existed in dedicated facilities that could not easily be converted or expanded. Damage a Japanese aircraft factory, and it might take months to repair and rebuild. American industry responded differently. When existing factories reached capacity, new ones were constructed in a matter of months. The sheer volume of American production began overwhelming Japanese expectations almost immediately. In 1942, American factories produced 47,000 military aircraft. This fell short of Roosevelt's ambitious 60,000 target, yet it represented nearly 10 times Japan's annual aircraft output of approximately 5,000. By 1943, production climbed to 85,000 aircraft, still below Roosevelt's goal of 125,000, but more planes than existed anywhere in the world just 10 years earlier. These were not merely fighters and bombers. They included transport aircraft, reconnaissance planes, trainer aircraft, gliders, and specialized types that Japan was not manufacturing in any significant quantity. By 1944, American aircraft production reached its peak at 96,000 units. When the war ended in 1945, the cumulative total stood at 297,000 military aircraft produced by American factories. Japan, mobilizing its entire industrial base for wartime production and accepting severe rationing and hardship on the home front, built 85,611 aircraft during the entire war from 1941 through 1945. The production ratio between America and Japan exceeded 3-to-1, sustained across 4 years of maximum effort by both nations. But the disparity went far deeper than simple numerical comparison. It represented fundamentally different approaches to industrial warfare. America was fighting a war of material abundance, accepting that some aircraft would be lost to accidents, mechanical failure, or enemy action, but confident they could be replaced faster than they were destroyed. Japan was fighting a war of scarcity, carefully rationing resources, unable to replace losses, watching its numerical strength decline month by month, regardless of tactical victories achieved on the battlefield. The transformation extended far beyond what the production charts showed. It represented a fundamental reorganization of American society that Japanese observers found incomprehensible. The Seattle plant operated by Boeing illustrates the point. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the facility employed 4,000 workers and produced aircraft at a measured pace. At the war's peak, the same plant employed 30,000 workers, operating 3 shifts daily, 7 days a week. The workforce had increased 7-fold in less than 3 years. Similar expansions occurred at every major defense contractor across America. Where did these workers come from? From every corner of American society. Women, who had comprised less than 1% of aircraft industry workers before the war, made up over 10% by mid-1942. By March 1943, women comprised 30% of aviation manufacturing employees. By 1945, in some facilities, women made up 65% of the aircraft industry workforce. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda. She was economic reality. Millions of women who left their homes and entered factories to support the war effort. These women were not merely supplementing the workforce in clerical roles or lighter assembly tasks. They were primary workers, performing every task previously reserved for men. They welded fuselages, riveted wing sections, assembled complex engines, operated heavy machinery, read blueprints, and performed quality control inspections. They worked swing shifts and graveyard shifts. They raised children, managed households, and worked 48-hour weeks in defense plants. Without them, American production targets would have been impossible. African Americans, systematically excluded from skilled industrial work in peacetime America, through both formal segregation and informal discrimination, found new opportunities in defense plants. Executive Order 8802, signed by Roosevelt in June 1941, prohibited racial discrimination in defense industries. While discrimination certainly continued in practice, the desperate need for workers in expanding wartime production forced American industry to tap labor pools previously denied access. By 1945, over 1 million African Americans worked in defense industries, gaining skills and earning wages that developed expectations of equality that would fuel the civil rights movement in the decades following the war. Teenagers left high schools to work in factories, with special programs allowing students to work half-days while continuing their education. The elderly came out of retirement, bringing decades of experience and work ethic to factories desperate for skilled labor. disabled individuals found employment in positions suited to their capabilities. The massive labor mobilization drew on essentially every available person in American society. By 1944, over 18 million Americans worked in defense-related industries. That represented nearly 1 in every 7 people in the entire nation. The Liberty Ship program demonstrated both American industrial capacity and innovative manufacturing approaches. These cargo vessels were specifically designed to be built quickly, using semi-skilled labor and standardized components produced at various facilities and assembled together. They began rolling off production lines at rates unprecedented in shipbuilding history. The most famous example was the SS Robert E. Peary, built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California. This record-setting construction was deliberately orchestrated as an incentive demonstration, with experienced workers, pre-stockpiled materials, and extensive special preparation. It was far faster than typical construction times, which averaged 42 to 50 days per ship. Yet even the normal pace was extraordinary by any historical standard. Ships that traditionally required months to build were being launched in weeks. At peak production in 1943, American shipyards launched 3 Liberty ships per day, 18 merchant vessels per week, 75 per month. By war's end, America had produced 2,710 Liberty ships, each carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. Combined, they represented more shipping capacity than existed in the entire Japanese merchant marine at the war's start. Japan's entire merchant ship construction program, operating at maximum wartime capacity, produced approximately 15 ships per month at its peak. The disparity was not merely overwhelming, it was strategically decisive. Consider the strategic implications. America could sustain simultaneous military operations across 2 oceans, supplying forces in Europe and the Pacific while maintaining civilian prosperity at home and sending massive aid to allies including Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. Japan could barely maintain supply lines to its own frontline forces while watching its merchant marine systematically destroyed by American submarines. By 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to roughly 10% of its pre-war tonnage, strangling Japanese industry of the raw materials it needed and depriving military forces of essential supplies. The mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory became evident to anyone willing to examine the production statistics objectively. Yet Japanese military leadership refused to confront reality. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, one of the principal architects of the Pearl Harbor attack and one of Japan's most brilliant aviation tacticians, wrote in his diary in March 1942, "Early, only 3 months into the war, we achieved tactical surprise, but I fear we have guaranteed strategic defeat. The Americans are not collapsing as we predicted. They are building, they are angry. They stood together, a unified force." When Genda voiced his doubts about the path ahead, military brass took notice. Rather than engage his questions, they simply removed him from his strategic role. The leadership wanted officers who believed in inevitable triumph, not those who dared to question it. 5 months after Pearl Harbor, in May of 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea became a watershed moment. For the first time since Japan had entered the war, an invasion fleet was repulsed before completing its mission. The Imperial Japanese Navy had aimed to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea, planning to establish air bases positioned for strikes against Australia and to secure the outer edge of Japan's defensive perimeter. American and Australian naval forces moved to intercept. What unfolded was unlike anything naval warfare had ever seen. The first battle where aircraft carriers fought each other without their ships ever glimpsing one another. The tactical exchange seemed roughly balanced. The Shoho went down, while the Shokaku sustained severe damage. The Americans lost the Lexington to the depths, and the Yorktown bore serious wounds. Yet the strategic picture told a different story altogether. What mattered most were the aircraft lost. 90 Japanese planes vanished along with 77 pilots. For Japan's naval aviation, this represented something far worse than tactical setback. It was the beginning of a crisis from which recovery would prove impossible. Japan's pilot training pipeline moved slowly, demanding years of rigorous preparation to develop experienced aviators. Replacing those 77 seasoned pilots would consume a year or more, assuming training capacity and fuel supplies remained available, but supplies were already tightening. The mathematics of attrition, which might have been manageable against a peer competitor, spelled disaster against an opponent whose factories operated without pause. Japan scrambled to rebuild its carriers and retrain replacement pilots. Meanwhile, American shipyards hummed around the clock. Fresh pilots graduated from flight schools every single week. Freshly constructed aircraft rolled from assembly lines hourly. The attrition equation tilted heavily in America's favor. Then came Midway, June 4th through 7th, 1942. It arrived almost exactly as Admiral Yamamoto had forecast, nearly half a year after Pearl Harbor. This engagement would transform the entire Pacific conflict, not through American tactical brilliance, which remained questionable, but by exposing a strategic vulnerability that America would exploit relentlessly over the coming 3 years. Yamamoto committed 4 fleet carriers to the operation: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These 4 vessels embodied the soul of Japanese naval aviation, the same carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor. The pilots flying from their decks represented the most experienced aviators in the world, hardened by years of combat across China, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean. They had flown together, trained together, developed a level of coordination and tactical excellence that American pilots, many with only months of experience, simply could not approach. Plane for plane and pilot for pilot, Japanese naval aviation stood superior to anything America could field in mid-1942. But this excellence evaporated the moment American dive bombers appeared over the Japanese carriers at precisely the right instant. American codebreakers working from a basement facility in Pearl Harbor had penetrated Japanese naval codes. They provided Admiral Chester Nimitz with remarkably precise intelligence about Japanese intentions. Nimitz positioned 3 carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, hurriedly repaired after Coral Sea, in concealed positions northeast of Midway Island. The Japanese, anticipating surprise, instead found themselves walking into an ambush. 5 minutes on the morning of June 4th decided everything. 3 squadrons of American dive bombers, arriving almost by chance rather than coordinated planning, discovered 3 Japanese carriers with their flight decks crammed with armed, fueled aircraft ready for launching. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu absorbed multiple bomb hits. Within moments, each transformed into an inferno. Fuel lines severed. Bomb magazines erupted. Ordnance detonated across packed flight decks. Vessels that had been Japan's greatest naval assets hours before became burning wrecks, ultimately scuttled to prevent capture. The Hiryu, operating separately, managed to strike back, crippling the Yorktown. But discovery and destruction followed later that same day. In a single calendar day, Japan lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers and somewhere between 248 and 320 aircraft, depending on accounting methods. 110 pilots perished, nearly a quarter of the entire air complement embarked on those 4 carriers. These were irreplaceable men. Their knowledge, their experience, their expertise, all gone permanently. American losses hurt. A Japanese submarine would sink the Yorktown days after battle's end. The destroyer Hammond, stationed alongside Yorktown providing salvage support, went down as well. 307 American servicemen died, but numbers alone told only half the story. America lost 1 carrier. Japan lost 4. America possessed factories capable of replacing carriers faster than Japan could develop pilots to fly from them. Japan lacked the capacity to replace either carriers or experienced aviators at the rate necessary for sustained warfare. The implications grew clearer month after month. In the 3 years spanning June 1942 through June 1945, Japan would commission 6 new carriers. During that identical period, America would complete 17 Essex-class carriers, each larger, swifter, and more formidable than Japanese counterparts. Every Essex-class vessel displaced 33,000 tons, carried between 90 and 100 aircraft, and featured damage control systems that rendered them extraordinarily difficult to sink. These were engineering marvels born from industrial genius. Yet carrier production represented merely one dimension of the broader industrial gap Midway had revealed. American shipyards, aviation factories, pilot schools, and every other naval aviation component were expanding at exponential rates. Japanese capacity remained essentially frozen or actually contracted as materials grew scarce and bombing progressively damaged facilities. The mathematical certainty of Japanese defeat became evident in monthly production figures. Consider aircraft output in granular detail. In 1941, before the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan manufactured roughly 5,000 aircraft, while America produced approximately 19,000, a ratio favoring America nearly 4-1. By 1942, American production soared to 47,000, while Japan achieved around 20,000, expanding the gap beyond 2-1. Throughout 1943, America built 85,000 aircraft against Japan's approximately 28,000, widening to 3-1. The disparity kept expanding through war's conclusion. By August 1945, America had manufactured 297,000 military aircraft. Japan had built 85,611 aircraft across the entire conflict from 1937 through 1945, including pre-war production. The sustained cumulative ratio exceeded 3-1 across years of maximum national mobilization. Yet simple ratios obscured the true disparity. American aircraft were typically larger, more mechanically sophisticated, longer-ranging, and more heavily weaponized than Japanese designs. A B-29 Superfortress demanded exponentially more industrial capacity than a Zero fighter, yet production statistics counted each as a single unit. The imbalance extended across every weapons category, illustrating systematic American industrial supremacy. Take armor production as illustration. America manufactured 86,000 tanks during World War II, including 33,000 Sherman medium tanks, the workhorse of American armored operations across both European and Pacific theaters. Japan produced roughly 6,500 tanks across the war, most of them light tanks weighing under 20 tons. These proved wholly inadequate against American medium tanks displacing 30 tons. Japan's Type 97 medium tank, its most common medium design, weighed 15 tons, mounted a 57mm gun, and offered only 25mm of frontal armor. The Sherman weighed 30 tons, carried a 75mm gun, and featured 50mm of frontal protection. In any tank versus tank confrontation, the Sherman possessed overwhelming advantages in striking power, defensive capability, and speed. Yet even had Japanese armor matched American quality exactly, the numerical advantage of 13-1 rendered Japanese tanks strategically irrelevant in Pacific operations. American armor could be committed in overwhelming quantity, guaranteeing triumph through sheer numbers, even when individual Japanese tanks possessed marginal technical superiority. American factories produced 2 million military trucks. Japan manufactured approximately 165,000 trucks, a ratio exceeding 12-1. This disparity reflected fundamentally incompatible logistical philosophies. American forces emphasized mobility, with infantry divisions possessing thousands of vehicles for movement and supply. Japanese operations depended on railroads, maritime transport, and human labor for logistics. When American forces severed Japanese supply lines, Japanese soldiers faced immobility and starvation. American forces, possessing abundant trucks and sophisticated supply organization, sustained operational capability and combat power, even in isolated locations. American shipyards launched roughly 6,800 naval vessels during the war: aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and support craft. Japan completed fewer than 1,000 naval ships. The gap existed across every vessel category. America produced 24 Essex-class fleet carriers. Japan completed 6 fleet carriers following Midway. America built over 400 destroyer escorts for convoy work. Japan constructed fewer than 70 escort vessels. American yards launched approximately 200 submarines. Japan built roughly 170, though American submarines achieved far greater effectiveness in commerce warfare and ultimately destroyed Japanese merchant fleets. The submarine campaign, demonstrates how industrial capability translated into strategic advantage. American submarines operating from Pearl Harbor, Australia, and eventually the Philippines methodically eliminated Japanese merchant shipping. By war's end, American submarines had destroyed approximately 60% of Japanese merchant tonnage and 30% of Japan's naval forces. This maritime strangulation cut off Japanese industry from Dutch East Indies petroleum, Malayan rubber, Philippine iron ore, and food sources throughout the Japanese sphere. Japan's war machine withered not from insufficient determination, but from absent raw materials that could no longer move safely across the ocean. Japan commenced hostilities with approximately 6 million tons of merchant vessels. By August 1945, less than 10% remained in operation. Japan possessed no replacement capacity, as shipyards operated at diminished rates due to material shortages and destructive bombing. America was constructing merchant ships faster than Japanese submarines could ever possibly sink them. Moreover, Japanese submarines concentrated on military warships rather than cargo vessels, a tactical decision that wasted one of Japan's few potentially effective weapons. Yet aggregate numbers provided only partial explanation for the industrial chasm separating the antagonists. American production transcended mere scale. It reflected a fundamentally distinct character: industrial integration, technological sophistication, and organizational capability that Japan could never replicate with existing resources and technical knowledge. The B-29 Superfortress exemplifies this distinction better than any single weapons system. Boeing designed the aircraft to solve a specific strategic challenge: how to strike Japan from distant bases when aircraft carriers could not safely operate close enough and island airbases remained unavailable. The designers specified the bomber to haul substantial bomb loads across 3,000-mile ranges while cruising above 30,000 feet, altitude exceeding most Japanese fighter capabilities. The resulting aircraft represented the most technologically advanced bomber of World War II, arguably the most sophisticated production aircraft any nation had built. Each contained 40,540 component parts, ranging from massive engine assemblies to microscopic electrical connectors. Manufacturing each required 12 tons of aluminum, plus copper, steel, rubber, and scarce materials like magnesium that Japan could scarcely acquire. 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each generating 2,200 horsepower, propelled the bomber at 350 miles per hour at operational altitude of 30,000 feet. Pressurized crew compartments allowed airmen to work in normal flight gear rather than restrictive heated suits. Remotely operated defensive gun turrets, aimed via sophisticated analog computers, provided armament. The B-29 transported up to 20,000 pounds of bombs, equivalent to the total payload of 20 fighters, across 3,000-mile distances. It struck targets previously beyond attack range, bringing warfare directly to Japanese population centers and industrial sites. America built approximately 4,000 of these aircraft between 1943 and 1945. Each represented industrial and technological capability exceeding Japan's entire annual aircraft production. America's ability to produce 4,000 B-29s while simultaneously manufacturing countless fighters, medium bombers, transport aircraft, and other types reveals the magnitude of American industrial mobilization. The strategic bombing offensive against Japan demonstrated both American production prowess and Japanese futility once American industry achieved full mobilization. The campaign intensified in November 1944 when B-29s operating from Mariana Island bases commenced regular strikes against Japanese industrial facilities. Early missions employed high-altitude precision bombing, targeting specific factories. Performance disappointed due to weather interference, navigation challenges, and Japan's distributed production network. In March 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay restructured the approach, directing low-altitude nocturnal firebombing against Japanese urban centers. Results proved catastrophic. Tokyo experienced firebombing on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945. 334 B-29s delivered 1,665 tons of incendiary ordnance designed to ignite uncontrollable conflagrations in densely packed wooden neighborhoods. The resulting firestorm consumed 16 square miles of Tokyo, killing approximately 100,000 people in a single night, more deaths than would result from atomic detonations at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The firestorm generated temperatures surpassing 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to boil water in drainage canals and liquefy glass. Residents seeking refuge in water boiled to death. Those remaining indoors perished in incineration. Those fleeing streets suffocated in smoke or burned in flames. Destruction proved comprehensive and terrible, surpassing previous conventional bombing campaigns. Yet this catastrophic raid, which inflicted greater casualties than any single air attack previously recorded, constituted just a fraction of American bombing capacity. Weeks later, similar devastation struck Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, and scores of smaller Japanese cities. By mid-1945, Japan's primary urban centers lay systematically demolished. American bombers distributed warning leaflets naming specific cities scheduled for destruction, then returned days later to obliterate them precisely as cautioned. This psychological assault demonstrated Japan's inability to defend itself physically or protect civilians from assault. Japanese fighter defenses, already weakened by years of attrition, proved powerless to prevent American bombers from operating nearly unchallenged above Japanese territory. 2 years following Midway, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated how thoroughly American production had superseded Japanese tactical expertise. The engagement unfolded during the American assault on the Mariana Islands, strategically essential because their occupation would position B-29s within effective bombing range of Japan. The Japanese Navy executed Operation Ago, deploying 9 carriers and supporting warships, attempting to eliminate American carrier formations and block the Mariana invasion. Japanese naval aviation, once the world's supreme air force in 1941, had been systematically hollowed through 2 years of grinding attrition. Veterans killed in earlier campaigns were succeeded by hastily prepared rookies possessing minimal flying experience and no combat seasoning. These replacement pilots, engaging American carrier formations that had multiplied massively since Midway, fell in overwhelming numbers during what American aviators termed the Great Mariana Turkey Shoot. On June 19, 1944, Japanese carrier aircraft unleashed massive assaults against American fleet carriers. American fighter defenses, guided through radar and orchestrated by experienced fighter directors, intercepted Japanese formations. The outcome devastated Japan. More than 600 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky in a single day, brought down by American fighters or bursts of anti-aircraft fire. The Americans lost roughly 30 planes. For every American aircraft destroyed, the Japanese lost more than 20 of theirs. For Japan, this catastrophic loss of 600 aircraft in just one day represented devastation almost impossible to comprehend. The American aircraft industry could manufacture 600 replacement planes in less than a week during peak production runs. Japan needed months to build that many aircraft, and even then, only if materials and workers remained available, which they increasingly did not. But there was something far worse than the loss of aircraft themselves. The pilots who flew those planes simply could not be replaced. Japan possessed no system for rapidly training hundreds of new carrier pilots. The few pilot training schools still operating struggled without fuel, without experienced instructors, and without serviceable aircraft for students to learn on. The Philippine Sea battle effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as any kind of meaningful force. After that moment, Japanese carriers took to the water with inadequate aircraft and fewer qualified pilots to fly them. When Japan's carriers appeared at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, they served mainly as bait, carrying minimal aircraft and designed only to lure American carriers away from the invasion beaches where the real battle unfolded. The tactic backfired completely, and Japanese naval power met its end. By war's conclusion, the Imperial Japanese Navy survived mainly as a collection of names on paper, with whatever ships remained sitting useless in harbors because no fuel existed to move them. Yet women's contribution to American industrial production deserves special recognition. because it represented a total mobilization of society that Japanese strategists had never imagined and could never match. Before the war, American social customs kept women out of heavy industry almost entirely. They worked as teachers, nurses, secretaries, or in light manufacturing if they worked outside the home at all. The factories producing weapons and armor remained entirely male workplaces. Defense industries employed almost no women before 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything overnight. As millions of American men marched into military service, defense factories desperately needed workers. The government created the War Power Commission in April 1942 to recruit women for industrial work. The famous Rosie the Riveter campaign emerged from this effort, showing a determined woman with sleeves rolled up declaring, "We can do it." The message captured the spirit of national mobilization, and women answered the call in stunning numbers. By 1943, more than 6 million women worked in defense factories, making up roughly 35% of the entire defense workforce. In some aircraft manufacturing plants, women represented 65% of the workers. These women took on every task that had previously belonged only to men. They wielded arc torches to weld airplane fuselages together. They operated hydraulic presses of immense size, shaping sheets of aluminum. They assembled engines containing thousands of precisely machined parts. They studied technical drawings and blueprints. They inspected finished products for quality. They drove forklifts and operated cranes. They worked assembly lines producing everything from ammunition to battleships. The change this brought to American society proved lasting and profound. Women discovered abilities they never knew they possessed. They earned money, achieved independence, learned new skills, and developed confidence in their own capabilities. Many returned to homes after the war ended, but those experiences had altered American society in permanent ways. The daughters of the women who built B-29 bombers and Liberty cargo ships would grow up demanding the same rights as men. Seeds planted during wartime industrial mobilization would grow into the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s. Japan's experience differed completely. Japanese women did participate in the war effort through farming, light manufacturing, and civil defense duties, but Japanese industrial culture refused to adapt and bring women into heavy manufacturing roles. This reflected partly cultural traditions, maintaining stricter gender separation than even pre-war America, but mostly practical circumstances. Japanese factories lacked the population surplus from which to recruit workers, because the Japanese government was not drafting men at anywhere near the scale America employed. Japan simply lacked the population size and industrial base to wage total war while keeping production levels anywhere near comparable to American output. The Manhattan Project stood as the ultimate demonstration of American industrial and scientific power, so vast and so secretive that most Americans never even knew it existed, yet it employed more than 130,000 people. The entire project cost approximately $2 billion, exceeding Japan's entire defense budget for certain years of the war. The industrial facilities constructed for the project represented engineering achievements by themselves. Tennessee's Oak Ridge, built from nothing in 1943, became a uranium enrichment facility of unprecedented scale. When running at capacity, Oak Ridge consumed 1/7 of every bit of electrical power generated across the entire United States, surpassing even the electricity demand of New York City. Huge electromagnetic separation machines designed to extract uranium-235 from the more abundant uranium-238 were built by companies that normally manufactured commercial electrical equipment. These companies retooled completely to produce atomic weapons components. Hanford, Washington built at the same time produced plutonium in nuclear reactors, operating at scales never attempted before. These reactors needed constant water cooling from the Columbia River, processed through installations representing the largest industrial complexes in the entire Pacific Northwest region. Everything about the operation remained experimental, founded on scientific principles barely grasped and engineering approaches never previously attempted. Los Alamos, New Mexico functioned as the design center where scientists and engineers constructed the bombs themselves. J. Robert Oppenheimer led a team of extraordinarily talented scientists, many of them refugees from Nazi-controlled Europe, racing against time to complete working weapons before Germany developed them first. The reality, revealed only after the war ended, was that Germany never came close. German atomic research ended in early 1942 after scientists determined that building weapons would consume resources Germany desperately needed for conventional arms. No other nation possessed all the pieces required for the Manhattan Project. Britain had exceptional scientists, but lacked the industrial foundation. The Soviet Union had gifted mathematicians and theorists, but lacked the technological infrastructure. Germany had begun first, but abandoned the effort. Japan possessed some of Earth's finest physicists, but could not access enough uranium, lacked the industrial base, and possessed no organization capable of coordinating a program of this scope and complexity. Only America brought together every essential element: scientific knowledge, industrial capacity, abundant electrical power, access to rare materials, engineering talent, financial resources, and most importantly, the organizational power to coordinate work across dozens of locations involving hundreds of companies and more than 130,000 employees. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, carried an atomic bomb toward Hiroshima. The weapon, called Little Boy, used uranium-235 and released energy equal to 15,000 tons of TNT. The blast killed between 70 and 80,000 people in moments and leveled 4 square miles of city. Many tens of thousands more would die in following weeks and months from burns and radiation sickness. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, another B-29 released a second bomb on Nagasaki. This weapon, named Fat Man, relied on plutonium and produced slightly more energy, approximately 21,000 tons of TNT equivalent. The blast killed between 40 and 60,000 people immediately in a city partially protected by surrounding hills that weakened the force of the blast. These attacks made crystal clear that Japan could no longer defend its people from American assault. Emperor Hirohito, speaking publicly for the first time ever in Japanese history, declared Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. In his radio broadcast, he specifically mentioned the atomic bombs as the reason for surrender, saying that the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. The official surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, concluding the Pacific War. Looking back at Japan's defeat reveals that Pearl Harbor, rather than representing Japan's greatest triumph, actually triggered the chain of events leading inevitably to collapse. Admiral Yamamoto had grasped this reality long before the attack began. His famous prediction, 6 months of victories followed by deteriorating circumstances, proved accurate almost to the calendar. The Battle of Midway occurred precisely 6 months after Pearl Harbor, from June 4 to 7, matching Yamamoto's forecast almost exactly. From that precise moment onward, American industrial capacity made Japanese defeat mathematically guaranteed, regardless of bravery, tactical brilliance, or willingness to sacrifice demonstrated by Japanese soldiers and sailors. Japanese military planners had committed multiple catastrophic errors in judgment, each one reinforcing the others to build a structure of strategic disaster. First came massive underestimation of American industrial capacity, off by a factor of 10 or greater. They understood that America produced more than Japan, but completely failed to grasp the potential scale of American production once the nation mobilized for war. Second, they concluded that American society was inherently soft, fractured by internal division, and too corrupted by comfort to organize itself for total war. They believed Americans preferred ease too much to endure the hardship necessary for victory. Pearl Harbor demonstrated this assumption to be catastrophically wrong, uniting American public opinion and creating a national resolve to fight until Japan surrendered completely and unconditionally. Third, Japanese military strategists believed that superior training and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. They trusted that their forces' excellent preparation, cultural determination, and tactical expertise would let them win despite inferior numbers and equipment. This overlooked a fundamental principle of modern warfare. When fighting involves millions of soldiers, and tens of thousands of aircraft and ships, quantity develops its own quality. Individual skill matters in direct combat, but when millions of people fight across continents, producing endless supplies of weapons and soldiers becomes decisive. American forces could accept casualties, learn lessons from defeats, and return stronger with better weapons and fresh troops. Japanese forces could replace nothing, and watched their military strength diminish with each passing month. Fourth, Japanese planners wagered that American public opinion would demand negotiations for peace after suffering initial defeats, rather than continuing a lengthy war. They imagined American deaths at Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines, and in early battles would create domestic pressure for compromise, leaving Japan in control of conquered territory. They fundamentally misread American political character and underestimated the national determination that the Pearl Harbor surprise attack had created. America instead chose to fight for complete surrender, accepting any casualties necessary to achieve total victory. These planners were wrong about everything, and their errors compounded because Japan's military leadership could not adapt when reality contradicted their assumptions. Military officers trained in cultures emphasizing spiritual power over material factors refused to accept that production capacity mattered more than warrior spirit. Offensives continued even when losses became unsustainable, driven by the belief that determination could somehow overcome mathematical certainty. American production figures tell the complete story of industrial mobilization that defeated Japan as thoroughly as any bomb or bullet. 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million military trucks. Approximately 6,800 naval vessels. These totals represent production achieved while America fought Germany and Italy across Europe and North Africa simultaneously, maintained American civilian living standards well above mere survival, and actually grew the overall American economy. From 1941 through 1945, American gross national product expanded by roughly 70%, while generating enough military equipment to arm American forces and supply substantial quantities to allied nations including Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and the Free French forces. Japan could not come anywhere close to these numbers, even when directing every available resource to weapons production and forcing civilians into extreme deprivation. By 1944, Japanese people existed on minimal rations. Entire cities were relocated to reduce food consumption demands. Manufacturing output was falling as American submarines tightened their blockade, cutting off raw material supplies. Meanwhile, American civilians enjoyed relative abundance. Food, though rationed, remained plentiful. Consumer products, though restricted, stayed available. American industrial production kept expanding. The human cost of the conflict was truly terrible and deserves acknowledgement despite the focus on production. Japan lost approximately 2.1 to 2.5 million military personnel and 550,000 to 800,000 civilians, with uncertainty stemming from incomplete records and ongoing disagreements about casualty figures from atomic bombings and firebombing campaigns. American losses in the Pacific totaled roughly 100,000 killed and 300,000 wounded. Substantial numbers, but proportionally far smaller than Japan's catastrophic losses. This casualty disparity reflected the war's essential reality. America sustained losses and replaced them with reinforcements, fresh equipment, and resilient morale. Japan could not. Every vessel sunk, every aircraft destroyed, every soldier killed meant irreplaceable loss for Japan, but merely temporary setback for America. By 1945, Japan fielded poorly trained pilots with minimal experience, flying aircraft patched together from salvaged parts. Engines burned fuel extracted from pine roots because real petroleum had disappeared. American pilots possessed superior training, flew better-designed aircraft, and operated from well-supplied secure bases. After the war, interviews with Japanese military leaders revealed their emotional response to American production power. General Kawabe Torashiro, serving on the Imperial General Staff throughout the conflict, later admitted during interrogation that Japanese planners had profoundly misunderstood American industrial capacity. Japan would have needed to increase production 20-fold to match American output, he acknowledged. An absolute impossibility given Japan's limited resources, industrial technology, worker population, and geographic constraints. Looking back with decades of perspective, he conceded, the conclusion should have been self-evident before the war started. Military force could never defeat America because its industrial capacity made military victory mathematically impossible. Admiral Yamamoto understood this and fought desperately to convince both military and political leaders before fighting began. He had lived in America from 1925 to 1927, attended Harvard University, traveled throughout the country extensively, and served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He recognized that once America's production apparatus mobilized, it would prove overwhelming. His famous 6-month prediction was not military strategy based on battle tactics or positions held. It represented industrial mathematics, plain and simple. He knew Japanese forces could win tactical engagements for approximately 6 months, the period needed for American industry to fully mobilize and American military to absorb losses, learn lessons, and return with crushing superiority. Beyond that threshold, American production capacity would bury Japanese forces through sheer material abundance, regardless of Japanese fighting quality or tactical skill. His forecast proved correct almost to the month, and his death in April 1943 meant he never witnessed the complete confirmation of his predictions or the tremendous devastation that his colleagues' refusal to listen inflicted upon Japan. American production during World War II left a legacy extending far beyond military victory over Japan and Germany. B-29 factories transformed into commercial airliner production facilities, establishing American aerospace dominance lasting to the present day. Shipyards that built Liberty cargo vessels began constructing container ships and tankers for worldwide trade. Industrial facilities mobilized for wartime converted successfully to peacetime production, positioning America as the world's supreme economic force for generations to come. That supremacy began with production targets announced 30 days after Pearl Harbor and was validated through achievements surpassing even Japan's darkest imaginings. Workers, engineers, and managers orchestrating this industrial mobilization merit recognition alongside combatants in war zones. They demonstrated that modern conflict demands total national mobilization, that triumph requires coordinated effort spanning entire populations, and that factory output proves as crucial as battlefield prowess. Women joining hulls of Liberty ships in Richmond shipyards fought for victory as significantly as Marines assaulting beaches at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Engineers developing mass production techniques for rapid aircraft assembly mattered as much as fighter pilots dominating skies above Japanese cities. America's entire home front mobilized for production in ways Japanese planners had deemed impossible in a democratic society where individuals retained freedoms and government authority remained constrained. The real story of what came after Pearl Harbor concerns industrial production, mobilizing resources, and systematic industrial power triumphing over military tactical skill. Japan's military forces possessed superb training, tactical proficiency, fearless courage, and readiness to sacrifice everything. Japanese pilots, sailors, and soldiers demonstrated remarkable skill and determination, earning respect from adversaries. Yet these exceptional qualities ultimately proved inadequate against an adversary manufacturing weapons faster than they could be destroyed, building ships faster than they could be sunk, and producing soldiers faster than they could be killed. Planes and aircraft kept rolling off production lines faster than any enemy could possibly shoot them down. When you looked at what happened during the war, one truth became absolutely clear. Modern combat was decided in factories just as much as it was decided on battlefields. Whichever nation could organize its industry effectively, keep production humming along efficiently, and maintain that output year after year without stopping, would ultimately defeat its enemies. Tactical victories and individual acts of bravery in combat mattered far less than raw industrial output. This hard lesson, driven home repeatedly throughout the Pacific War, would influence military strategy for decades to come. It directly fueled the intense competition between America and the Soviet Union in the long Cold War that followed. Today, military historians look back on Pearl Harbor as one of the worst strategic blunders in recorded history. Japan attacked a nation possessing more than 10 times their own industrial capacity. The Japanese military believed their superior fighting skills, their warrior spirit, and their element of tactical surprise could overcome the material disadvantage they faced. They gambled that America would seek peace negotiations after suffering early losses rather than fully mobilizing for total war. Japan's leadership assumed the American population was too divided, too comfortable, too individualistic to accept the enormous sacrifices that total war demanded. They were spectacularly wrong on every single count. The price of being wrong proved catastrophic. Complete military defeat, foreign occupation on their soil for the first time in their history, atomic destruction of cities, the collapse of their empire, and the fundamental reshaping of their entire society and government. Between Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway, just 6 months passed. That period revealed the astonishing speed and completeness of American industrial mobilization. The remaining 3.5 years of fighting demonstrated something even more sobering. Once that mobilization reached full capacity, American victory became inevitable. Japan simply could not compete with American production, no matter what they attempted. President Roosevelt had announced his production targets just 30 days after Pearl Harbor in his State of the Union address. Japanese intelligence initially dismissed these numbers as nothing but propaganda designed to boost American morale and nothing more. Yet Roosevelt's ambitious goals, viewed across the time frame he had specified, were largely achieved or actually exceeded. He had called for 60,000 aircraft in 1942. The actual figure came in at 47,000, falling short of the target but still representing nearly 10 times what Japan produced annually. For 1943, Roosevelt wanted 125,000 aircraft. The actual production reached 85,000. Missing that target still meant American factories were producing vastly more than Japanese factories could dream of matching, and these numbers represented more total aircraft than existed anywhere on Earth just a decade earlier. Tank production targets were met or exceeded throughout the 2-year period. Roosevelt asked for 45,000 tanks in 1942 and 75,000 in 1943, totaling 120,000 over that span. American factories ultimately produced 86,000 tanks during the entire war, a remarkable achievement. Shipyard production dramatically exceeded Roosevelt's requests. American factories launched far more tonnage than he had even dared to ask for. Anti-aircraft gun production met or exceeded every goal set. The contrast between what Japan had expected America could produce and what America actually delivered stands as a stark warning about the dangers of misunderstanding your opponent. It shows what happens when you base major strategic decisions on assumptions rather than cold facts, when you believe what you wish were true instead of accepting reality as it actually exists. Japan's military planners worked from incomplete information. They operated from cultural assumptions that turned out to be completely false. They consistently underestimated American determination and resolve. Most dangerously, they engaged in strategic wishful thinking that ignored evidence contradicting their preferred narrative. They believed what they wanted to believe, what matched their preconceived notions about American weakness and Japanese superiority, rather than conducting objective mathematical analysis of relative industrial capacity and strategic resources. Admiral Yamamoto, who had actually lived in America and understood American industrial power firsthand from personal experience, tried desperately to warn them. His warnings fell on deaf ears. His colleagues dismissed his concerns as defeatism and lack of proper fighting spirit. The result was catastrophic military defeat, occupation by foreign forces, atomic bombing, the loss of their empire, and complete transformation of Japanese government and society itself. When you look at the complete production statistics across every single category, American achievement becomes almost overwhelming in its scale. America constructed 297,000 aircraft while simultaneously fighting across multiple continents and oceans. Japan, focusing almost entirely on one theater of war, built 85,611 aircraft. America produced 86,000 tanks. Japan manufactured approximately 6,500. America launched roughly 6,800 naval vessels of all types. Japan completed fewer than a handful, In absolutely every category of military production, in every measure of industrial output, in every comparison of war-making capacity, the gap was enormous, remained enormous, across 4 complete years of fighting, and ultimately determined who would win the war. The most revealing assessment of Pearl Harbor's strategic consequences comes directly from Japanese sources themselves, from the very officers and leaders who planned and executed the attack and survived long enough to see what their decision had wrought. Admiral Yamamoto, before his death on April 18, 1943, when his aircraft was shot down by P-38 Lightning fighters flying from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in an ambush made possible by code breaking, had written in private correspondence that the attack had been a tactical success, but a strategic catastrophe of the highest magnitude. Yes, it destroyed battleships, impressive targets that generated good propaganda, but these vessels were becoming increasingly obsolete in an era of carrier warfare. The attack missed the aircraft carriers, which would prove to be the truly decisive weapons. More importantly, the attack unified American public opinion, which had been sharply divided between those who wanted America to enter the war and those who wanted to stay out of it. It created a national consensus for total war that ordinary political processes might never have achieved. It guaranteed American entry into the conflict with fierce determination rather than reluctant participation that Japan might possibly have negotiated through diplomatic channels. Most critically, it awakened American industrial capacity, mobilized American society completely, and triggered the transformation that made Japanese defeat absolutely inevitable. The very attack designed to cripple American naval power and enable Japanese victory instead guaranteed Japanese defeat by arousing an opponent whose industrial capacity, once awakened, proved completely unstoppable. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor with a surprise attack that Americans perceived as treacherous and without honor, Japan triggered the most rapid and complete industrial mobilization in human history. This transformation happened because American industrial capacity, which Japanese planners had fundamentally misunderstood and systematically underestimated, mobilized with unprecedented speed, achieved unprecedented scale, and operated with unprecedented efficiency. The workers in American factories won the Pacific War just as surely as soldiers in combat zones. The women welding together bomber fuselages in the heat and noise of the factories, the men casting tank armor, the engineers continually optimizing production lines to squeeze out more output, the managers coordinating complex supply chains. Every single person who contributed to American industrial output from December 1941 through August 1945 played a vital role in defeating Japan. The industrial might that shocked Japanese observers and convinced them of inevitable defeat was not propaganda, not exaggeration, not temporary achievement. It was mathematics, cold calculation, systematic mobilization of resources and capabilities that Japan could never match. It rewrote the strategic balance of the entire Pacific War in 6 transformative months, from December 7, 1941 to June 7, 1942, demonstrating conclusively that modern warfare would be won by industrial capacity as much as military skill, that production mattered as much as tactics, and that nations attacking opponents with vastly superior industrial resources took enormous risks. The transformation of American society during this period deserves closer examination because it represents perhaps history's most complete example of a democratic society mobilizing for total war. Unlike authoritarian governments that could force sacrifice through coercion and command, American mobilization occurred through voluntary participation, economic rewards, patriotic appeals, and social pressure that worked together. Defense workers earned good wages, often substantially better than their pre-war jobs. Women entering factories gained economic independence along with patriotic purpose. African Americans discovered opportunities that pre-war society had denied them. The mobilization succeeded not through coercion, but through aligning individual interests with national goals, so both moved in the same direction. The War Production Board, directed first by Donald Nelson and then by Julius Krug, starting in 1944, coordinated this enormous industrial mobilization with remarkable effectiveness given the extraordinary scale and complexity involved. The board allocated scarce materials, set production priorities, resolved conflicts between competing demands, and ensured that production facilities operated at maximum capacity around the clock. The board's work represented economic planning on scales previously attempted only by totalitarian governments. Yet it operated within democratic constraints, responding to political pressures, negotiating with industry leaders, and maintaining public support for difficult decisions. The achievement becomes even more impressive when considering the obstacles it had to overcome. American industry in 1941 was not prepared for war production. Factories designed to manufacture civilian goods required extensive retooling for military purposes. Workers needed training for unfamiliar tasks they had never performed. Supply chains had to be completely reorganized. Management systems developed for peacetime production proved inadequate for wartime demands. Yet within just months, American industry transformed itself almost completely, achieving production levels that Japanese observers found literally unbelievable, even when confronted with hard evidence. The speed of transformation exceeded anything Japanese planners had considered possible. In their calculations of American industrial potential, Japanese analysts had assumed that democratic societies with competing interests and limited government power would mobilize slowly and incompletely. They believed labor disputes would disrupt production, that racial tensions would undermine cooperation, that political divisions would prevent unified action. The unity and speed of American mobilization after Pearl Harbor shattered these assumptions completely. Think about the social implications of this mobilization. Women entering factories in massive numbers challenged the traditional gender roles that society had enforced for generations and demonstrated capabilities that pre-war America had either denied or simply ignored. African Americans gaining industrial employment and military service directly challenged racial segregation and planted seeds for civil rights movements that would transform American society in the decades ahead. The shared experience of war mobilization, of working toward common goals, of sacrificing for the collective good, strengthened American national identity and demonstrated that democratic societies could mobilize as effectively as authoritarian regimes without surrendering fundamental freedoms. The Japanese military leadership's fundamental misunderstanding of American society contributed directly to their strategic defeat. They believed democracy was weakness, that freedom meant decadence, that individualism prevented collective action. Pearl Harbor proved them catastrophically and completely wrong. American democracy, aroused by a surprise attack perceived as treacherous, mobilized more completely and effectively than Japanese authoritarianism could have managed. American individualism, channeled toward national purpose, achieved more than Japanese conformity ever could. American diversity, drawing upon the talents and energies of every group in society, outproduced Japanese homogeneity significantly. The lessons extended far beyond World War II, shaping Cold War competition and influencing military thinking for generations to come. The nation that could mobilize industrial capacity most effectively, that could organize production most efficiently, that could sustain output most reliably over time, would possess decisive advantages in prolonged conflicts. This understanding drove Cold War arms races, space competition, and technological development. The pattern established in the Pacific War, where American industrial capacity proved decisive, repeated itself throughout the Cold War competition, where American economic strength ultimately exceeded Soviet capacity, despite Soviet advantages in certain military technologies. The human stories behind the statistics deserve remembrance and respect. The teenage girl from Iowa who left high school to weld Liberty ship hulls, earning wages that supported her family and discovering capabilities she had never suspected she possessed. The African-American man from Mississippi who migrated to Detroit and found factory work paying 3 times what he had earned as a sharecropper, experiencing for the first time in his life what economic opportunity truly felt like. The grandmother from Oregon who came out of retirement to inspect aircraft parts, bringing decades of accumulated experience to quality control work that ensured American pilots flew safe aircraft. Multiply these individuals by millions across America, and you see how transformed the nation and changed world history. They were not soldiers. They did not fire weapons. They never saw combat. Yet their contributions were as essential to victory as any battle won, any island captured, any enemy defeated in direct combat. They proved that modern warfare required total societal mobilization, that civilians mattered as much as soldiers, that the home front was as important as the battlefield. The legacy of their achievement extends to the present day. The industrial base they built supported American prosperity for generations afterward. The social changes they initiated, particularly regarding women's roles and racial equality, transformed American society in profound ways. The demonstration that democratic societies could mobilize effectively provided the ideological foundation for Cold War competition and continues to influence contemporary debates about governance and social organization. Japan learned these lessons through catastrophic defeat, through occupation by foreign forces, through fundamental transformation of its society and government. The Japan that emerged from defeat became one of the world's most successful democracies and industrial powers, building prosperity through peaceful competition rather than military conquest. This transformation occurred partly because Japanese leaders who survived the war understood precisely what had defeated them. They had witnessed American industrial capacity firsthand. They understood that prosperity came from production, not conquest, from cooperation, not coercion, from freedom, not authoritarianism. The world learned these lessons by watching American industry transform the very nature of warfare itself, establishing patterns and principles that would shape military competition for generations and define the nature of great power conflict in the industrial age. The 6 months from Pearl Harbor to Midway proved that surprise attacks and tactical brilliance were insufficient against opponents possessing overwhelming industrial advantages. The remaining years of war proved that once mobilized, American industrial capacity could sustain military operations across multiple theaters simultaneously while maintaining civilian prosperity. No other nation achieved this remarkable feat during World War II. The final measure of American achievement appears in comparative statistics across all combatants. America produced approximately 40% of all military equipment manufactured by all nations during World War II, despite comprising only 6% of world population. This ratio of production to population, sustained across 4 years of maximum effort, exceeded anything achieved in human history and demonstrated conclusively that democratic capitalism could mobilize resources as effectively as any authoritarian system, while maintaining political freedom and actually improving civilian standards of living. The industrial mobilization that defeated Japan continues teaching lessons about national power, societal resilience, and the sources of strength in modern competition between nations. Physical courage matters. Tactical skill matters. Strategic intelligence matters. But in prolonged conflicts between industrial powers, production capacity matters most. The nation that can build more, build faster, and build better will eventually overwhelm opponents regardless of temporary tactical setbacks or individual heroism displayed in combat. Admiral Yamamoto understood this truth and tried desperately to warn his nation. His warnings were ignored with catastrophic results. The attack on Pearl Harbor, intended to cripple American naval power and enable Japanese victory, instead aroused American industrial might and guaranteed Japanese defeat. The 6 months from December 7, 1941 to June 7, 1942 saw American production accelerate from peacetime to wartime levels with unprecedented speed. The numbers tell a story of systematic mobilization that overwhelmed Japanese capacity completely and left no doubt about the outcome. In January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, American factories were already retooling rapidly for war production. By February, automobile manufacturing had ceased entirely as every resource shifted to military needs. By March, aircraft production was accelerating noticeably month after month. By April, shipyards were launching vessels at unprecedented rates that staggered observers. By May, the Battle of Coral Sea demonstrated that American naval power was recovering rapidly from the initial blow. In June, at Midway, American forces delivered a strategic blow from which Japan would never recover. Each month brought new evidence of American industrial power mobilizing with remarkable effectiveness. Each month saw production figures exceed previous records. Each month demonstrated that Roosevelt's seemingly impossible production goals were becoming actual reality. Japanese intelligence officers monitoring American production through various intelligence sources struggled to believe their own reports. The numbers seemed impossible, absolutely impossible, yet they were real, verified, and undeniable. The following 3 years saw that production sustained and expanded continuously until victory was achieved completely, unconditionally, and irreversibly. American forces island-hopped across the vast Pacific, each operation supported by overwhelming material superiority that grew month by month. American submarines strangled Japanese commerce, enabled by production that replaced lost submarines faster than Japan could sink them. American aircraft dominated the Pacific skies, shooting down Japanese planes in lopsided ratios that reflected both superior training and vastly superior numbers available. By 1945, Japan's situation was hopeless by any objective measure. Cities burned from strategic bombing campaigns. The merchant marine lay destroyed. Industrial production had collapsed. Food shortages approached starvation levels. Military forces fought with obsolete equipment, inadequate supplies, and dwindling numbers of troops. Yet Japanese leadership refused to surrender until atomic bombs demonstrated that America possessed weapons against which no defense existed, and that continuation of war meant national annihilation. The contrast between Japanese expectations in December 1941 and Japanese reality in August 1945 could hardly be more stark and complete. Japan began the war expecting quick victories, territorial gains, and a negotiated peace that would leave their empire intact and powerful. Japan ended the war with cities destroyed, empire lost, military defeated, and their nation occupied by foreign forces for the first time in recorded history. The transformation from confident aggressor to defeated and occupied nation occurred in less than 4 years. This transformation was driven primarily by American industrial capacity that exceeded Japanese worst fears and proved impossible to resist or overcome through any means available. This complete reversal of fortune, this total defeat of an opponent that had seemed unstoppable in early 1942, resulted directly from American industrial mobilization that began in response to Pearl Harbor and achieved levels of production that rewrote all strategic calculations. The Pacific War, despite its many battles, its countless acts of heroism, its technological innovations, and its tactical complexities, was ultimately decided by industrial capacity. America possessed it in overwhelming abundance. Japan did not. That fundamental difference was decisive, determinative, and ultimately overwhelming, transforming the Pacific region, establishing American dominance that persisted for generations, and demonstrating conclusively that modern warfare would be won in factories as certainly as on battlefields.